The grid plan, grid street plan. A gridiron plan is a type of city plan in which streets run at right angles to each other, forming a grid. In the context of the culture of ancient Rome, the grid plan method of land measurement was called Centuriation. Ancient grid plans. The grid plan dates from antiquity and originated in multiple cultures. Some of the earliest planned cities were built using grid plans. By 2600 BC, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, major cities of the Indus Valley civilization, were built with blocks divided by a grid of straight streets, running north, south and east-west. Each block was subdivided by small lanes. The cities and monasteries of Gandhara, dating from the 1st millennium BC to the 11th century AD, also had grid-based designs. Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan since 1959, was also founded on the grid plan of the nearby ruined city of Sirkap. A workers' village at Giza, Egypt, housed a rotating labor force and was laid out in blocks of long galleries separated by streets in a formal grid. Many pyramid cult cities used a common orientation, a north-south axis from the royal palace and an east-west axis from the temple, meeting at a central plaza where king and god merged and crossed. Hammurabi was a king of the Babylonian Empire who made Babylon one of the greatest cities in antiquity. He rebuilt Babylon, building and restoring temples, city walls and public buildings, and building canals for irrigation. The streets of Babylon were wide and straight, intersected approximately at right angles, and were paved with bricks and bitumen. The tradition of grid plans is continuous in China from the 15th century BC onward in the traditional urban planning of various ancient Chinese states. Guidelines put into written form in the Caogongji during the spring and autumn periods stated, a capital city should be square on plan. 3 gates on each side of the perimeter lead into the 9 main streets that crisscross the city and define its grid pattern. And for its layout the city should have the royal court situated in the south, the marketplace in the north, the imperial ancestral temple in the east and the altar to the gods of land and grain in the west. Teotihuacan, near modern-day Mexico City, is the largest ancient grid plan site in the Americas. The city's grid covered 8 square miles. Perhaps the most well-known grid system is that spread through the colonies of the Roman Empire. The archetypal Roman grid was introduced to Italy first by the Greeks, with such information transferred by way of trade and conquest. The ancient Greek grid. Although the idea of the grid was present in Hellenic societal and city planning, it was not pervasive prior to the 5th century BC. However, it slowly gained primacy through the work of Hippodamus of Miletus, who planned and replanned many Greek cities in accordance with this form. The concept of a grid as the ideal method of town planning had become widely accepted by the time of Alexander the Great. His conquests were a step in the propagation of the grid plan throughout colonies, some as far-flung as Taxila in Pakistan, that would later be mirrored by the expansion of the Roman Empire. The Greek grid had its streets aligned roughly in relation to the cardinal points and generally looked to take advantage of visual cues based on the hilly landscape typical of Greece and Asia Minor. This was probably best exemplified in Priene, in present-day western Turkey, where the orthogonal city grid was based on the cardinal points, on sloping terrain that struck views out towards the river and the city of Miletus. Ancient Roman civilization. The Etruscan people, whose territories in Italy encompassed what would eventually become Rome, founded what is now the city of Marzabotto at the end of the 6th century BC. It was based on Greek Ionic ideas, and it was here that the main east-west and north-south axes of a town could first be seen in Italy. According to Stanislavski, there is little evidence that the Romans adopted the Etruscan model at Marzabotto early rapidly in their expansion. Instead, the Roman grid was spread around the Mediterranean and into northern Europe later on, during the late Republic and early Empire. The military expansion of this period facilitated the adoption of the grid form as standard. The Romans established castra first as military centers, some of them developed into administrative hubs. The Roman grid was similar in form to the Greek version of a grid, but allowed for practical considerations. For example, Roman castra were often sited on flat land, especially close to or on important nodes like river crossings or intersections of trade routes. The dimensions of the castra were often standard, with each of its four walls generally having a length of 2,150 feet. Familiarity was the aim of such standardization. Soldiers could be stationed anywhere around the empire, and orientation would be easy within established towns if they had a standard layout. Each would have the aforementioned Decumanus Maximus and Cardo Maximus at its heart, and their intersection would form the forum, around which would be sited important public buildings. Indeed, such was the degree of similarity between towns that Higgins states that soldiers would be housed at the same address as they moved from castra to castra. Pompeii has been cited by both Higgins and Lawrence as the best preserved example of the Roman grid. Outside of the castra, large tracts of land were also divided in accordance with the grid within the walls. These were typically 2,400 feet per side and contained 100 parcels of land. The Decumanus Maximus and Cardo Maximus extended from the town gates out towards neighboring settlements. These were lined up to be as straight as possible, only deviating from the path due to natural obstacles that prevented a direct route, while the imposition of only one town form regardless of region could be seen as an imposition of imperial authority. There is no doubting the practical reasoning behind the formation of the Roman grid. Under Roman guidance, the grid was designed for efficiency and interchangeability, both facilitated by and aiding the expansion of their empire. Asia from the first millennium AD, as Japan and the Korean peninsula became politically centralized in the 7th century AD, those societies adopted Chinese grid planning principles in numerous locations. In Korea, Gyeongju, the capital of unified Silla, and Sangyeong, the capital of Bali, adapted the Tang dynasty Chinese model. The ancient capitals of Japan, such as Fujiwara, Kyo, Nara, and Kyoto, also adapted from Tang's capital, Chang'an. However, for reasons of defense, the planners of Tokyo eschewed the grid, opting instead for an irregular network of streets surrounding the Edo castle grounds. In later periods, some parts of Tokyo were grid-planned, but grid plans are generally rare in Japan, and the Japanese addressing system is accordingly based on increasingly fine subdivisions, rather than a grid. The grid planning tradition in Asia continued through the beginning of the 20th century, with Sapporo, Japan following a grid plan under American influence. Europe and its colonies. New European towns were planned using grids beginning in the 12th century, most prodigiously in the bastions of southern France that were built during the 13th and 14th centuries. Medieval European new towns using grid plans were widespread, ranging from Wales to the Florentine region. Many were built on ancient grids originally established as Roman colonial outposts. The Roman model was also used in Spanish settlements during the Reconquista of Ferdinand and Isabella. It was subsequently applied in the new cities established during the Spanish colonization of the Americas, after the founding of San Cristobal de la Laguna in 1496. In 1573, King Philip II of Spain compiled the laws of the Indies to guide the construction and administration of colonial communities. The laws specified square or rectangular central plaza with 8 principal streets running from the plaza's corners. Hundreds of grid plan communities throughout the Americas were established according to this pattern, echoing the practices of earlier Indian civilizations. The grid plan became popular with the start of the Renaissance in Northern Europe. In 1606, the newly founded city of Mannheim in Germany was the first Renaissance city laid out on the grid plan. Later came the new town in Edinburgh and almost the entire city centre of Glasgow, and many planned communities and cities in Australia, Canada and the United States such as New Haven and Adelaide. The Baroque capital city of Malta Valletta, dating back to the 16th century, was built following a rigid grid plan of uniformly designed houses, dotted with palaces, churches and squares. Early United States. Many of the earliest cities in the United States, such as Boston, did not start with a grid system. However, even in pre-revolutionary days some cities saw the benefits of such a layout. New Haven Colony, one of the earliest colonies in America, was designed with a tiny 9-square grid at its founding in 1638. On a grander scale, Philadelphia was designed on a rectilinear street grid in 1682, one of the first cities in North America to use a grid system. At the urging of city founder William Penn, surveyor Thomas Home designed a system of wide streets intersecting at right angles between the Schuylkill River to the west and the Delaware River to the east, including 5 squares of dedicated parkland. Penn advertised this orderly design as a safeguard against overcrowding, fire and disease, which plagued European cities. Home drafted an ideal version of the grid, but alleyways sprouted within and between larger blocks as the city took shape. Arguably the most famous grid plan in history is the plan for New York City, formulated in the Commissioner's Plan of 1811, a visionary proposal by the state legislature of New York for the development of most of Manhattan above Houston Street. Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States, was planned under French-American architect Pierre-Charles L'Enfant. Under the L'Enfant Plan, the original District of Columbia was developed using a grid plan that is interrupted by diagonal avenues, most famously Pennsylvania Avenue. These diagonals are often connected by traffic circles, such as DuPont Circle and Washington Circle. As the city grew, the plan was duplicated to cover most of the remainder of the capital. Meanwhile, the core of the city faced disarray, and the Macmillan Plan, led by Senator James Macmillan, was adopted to build a national mall and a park system that is still today a jewel of the city. Often, some of the streets in a grid are numbered, lettered, or arranged in alphabetical order. Downtown San Diego uses all 3 schemes. North-south streets are numbered from west to east, and east-west streets are split between a lettered series running southward from A through L and a series of streets named after trees or plants, running northward alphabetically from Ash to Walnut. As in many cities, some of these streets have been given new names violating the system. This has meant that second, not first, is the most common street name in the United States. An exception to the typical, uniform grid is the plan of Savannah, Georgia, known as the Oglethorpe Plan. It is a composite, cellular city block consisting of 4 large corner blocks, 4 small blocks in between and a public square in the center. The entire composition of approximately 10 acres is known as a ward. Its cellular structure includes all the primary land uses of a neighborhood and has for that reason been called fractal. Its street configuration presages modern traffic calming techniques applied to uniform grids where certain selected streets become discontinuous or narrow. thus discouraging through traffic. The configuration also represents an example of functional shared space where pedestrian and vehicular traffic can safely and comfortably coexist. In the westward development of the United States, the use of the grid plan was nearly universal in the construction of new settlements, such as in Salt Lake City, Dodge City and Oklahoma City. In these western cities the streets were numbered even more carefully than in the east to suggest future prosperity and metropolitan status. One of the main advantages of the grid plan was that it allowed the rapid subdivision and auction of a large parcel of land. For example, when the legislature of the Republic of Texas decided in 1839 to move the capital to a new site along the Colorado River, the functioning of the government required the rapid population of the town, which was named Austin. Charged with the task, Edwin Waller designed a 14-block grid that fronted the river on 640 acres. After surveying the land, Waller organized the almost immediate sale of 306 lots, and by the end of the year the entire Texas government had arrived by oxcart at the new site. Apart from the speed of surveying advantage, the rationale at the time of the grid's adoption in this and other cities remains obscure. Late 19th century to the present, Ildefonso Cerda, a Spanish civil engineer, defined a concept of urban planning based on the grid that he applied to the example of Barcelona. The example grid introduced innovative design elements which were exceptional at the time and even unique among subsequent grid plans. A very large block measuring 113 by 113 meters, far larger than the old city blocks and larger than any Roman, Greek blocks and the mutations. A 20 meters road width compared to mostly 3 meters in the old city. Square blocks with truncated corners and major roads, perpendicular and diagonal, measuring 50 meters in width. These innovations he based on functional grounds. The block size, to enable the creation of a quiet interior open space and allow ample sunlight and ventilation to its perimeter buildings. The rectilinear geometry, the wide streets and boulevards to sustain high mobility and the truncated corners to facilitate turning of carts and coaches and particularly vehicles on fixed trails. In maps of larger American cities, the downtown areas are almost always grids. These areas represent the original land dimensions of the founded city, generally around 1 square mile. Some cities expanded the grid further out from the center, but maps also show that, in general, as the distance from the center increases, a variety of patterns emerge in no particular discernible order. In juxtaposition to the grid they appear random. These new patterns have been systematically classified and the design characteristics measured. In the United States, the grid system was widely used in most major cities and the suburbs until the 1960s. However, during the 1920s, the rapid adoption of the automobile caused a panic among urban planners, who, based on observation, claimed that speeding cars would eventually kill tens of thousands of small children per year. Apparently, at this early stage of the car's entry into the grid, the streets of major cities worldwide were the scene of virtual slaughter, as the fatality rate in proportion to population was more than double the current rate. In 2009, after several decades of road safety improvements and a continuous decline in fatalities, an estimated 33,963 people died in motor vehicle traffic crashes and, according to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, motor vehicle crashes are the leading cause of death for children from 3 to 14 years old. Planners, therefore, called for an inwardly focused superblock arrangement that minimized through automobile traffic and discouraged cars from traveling on anything but arterial roads. Traffic generators, such as apartment complexes and shops, would be restricted to the edges of the superblock along the arterial. This paradigm prevailed between about 1930 and 1960, especially in Los Angeles, where notable examples include Lyamat Park and Panorama City. A prominent 20th-century urbanist, Lewis Mumford, severely criticized some of the grid's characteristics, with a T-square and a triangle. Finally, the municipal engineer could, without the slightest training as either an architect or a sociologist, plan a metropolis with its standard lots, its standard blocks, its standard street widths, in short, with its standardized comparable and replaceable parts. The new gridiron plans were spectacular in their inefficiency and waste, by usually failing to discriminate sufficiently between main arteries and residential streets. The first were not made wide enough, while the second were usually too wide for purely neighborhood functions. As for its contribution to the permanent social functions of the city, the anonymous gridiron plan proved empty. In the 1960s, traffic engineers and urban planners abandoned the grid virtually wholesale in favor of a street hierarchy. This is a thoroughly asymmetric street arrangement in which a residential subdivision, often surrounded by a noise wall or a security gate, is completely separated from the road network except for one or two connections to arterial roads. In a way, this is a return to medieval styles. As noted in Spiro Kostoff's seminal History of Urban Design, The City Shape, there is a strong resemblance between the street arrangements of modern American suburbs and those of medieval Arab and Moorish cities. In each case, the community unit at hand, the clan or extended family in the Muslim world, the economically homogeneous subdivision in modern suburbia isolates itself from the larger urban scene by using dead ends and cul-de-sac. Milton Keynes' one famous grid system is in the British new town of Milton Keynes. In this planned city, which began construction in 1967, a system of 10 horizontal and 11 vertical roads was used, with roundabouts at each intersection. The horizontal roads were all given names ending in W and H numbers. The vertical roads were given names ending in street and V numbers. Each grid road was spaced roughly 1 kilometer along from the next, forming squares of approximately 1 square kilometer. Each square and each roundabout was given its own name. The system provided very easy transport within the city, although it confused visitors who were unfamiliar with the system. The grid squares thus formed are far larger than the city blocks described earlier, and the road layouts within the grid squares are generally organic in form, matching the street hierarchy model described above.